There were two ages of imperialism, Old and New. Old imperialism occurred between 16th and 18th centuries. Instead of establishing colonies, Europeans built a series of trading stations in Africa and Asia. The Portuguese were first to establish the African slave trade in the New World, also known as the Americas. Europeans in Asia would respect and cooperate with local rulers where trade blossomed between the Loyals and Europeans in areas such as India, China, Japan, and Indonesia. However, the Americas were the exception to this process. Native Americans were severely subjugated in South and Mesoamerica, and England colonized the east coast of North America, which eventually settled into the beginning 13 American colonies. Sugar colonies were established in the Caribbean by France and England, and in Brazil by Portugal. A plethora of Europeans left their homelands to migrate to predominantly European-populated areas around the world. Between the years 1815 and 1932, over 60 million people left Europe. Immigrants inhabited North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and Siberia. Most immigrants were poor farmers. Jews who left for the U.S. were least likely to return because of persecution. New imperialism began in the 1880s in Africa and even earlier in Asia. The main idea behind it was the gain of full control of colonies, trade networks, etc. European control of the world's territory increased from 7% in 1800 to 84% in 1914. Europeans used military power to control African and Asian local governments to exploit them for Europe's gain. Causes for the imperialist impulse were the search for new markets and raw materials, as this was also the era of the Industrial Revolution. Raw materials reaped from the colonies included ivory, rubber, diamonds, cocoa, tea, cotton, and spices. Missionaries, whose goal was to spread religion, took imperialism as an opportunity to introduce Christianity to Africa and Asia, and its greatest area of success proved to be the sub-Saharan Africa. There was much tension between the haves, such as Britain, and the have-nots, such as Germany, who joined the imperialist movement late. New ideologies surfaced in this era, including nationalism, loyalty, pride in one's country, social Darwinism, which is survival of the fittest, and the white man's burden. Superior Westerners were obligated to bring their culture to uncivilized people. Exploration of the interior of Africa began in the late 1870s, and all European countries quickly jumped at the prospect of new territory. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 established rules for Africa's division. This race for land was called the Scramble for Africa, with the Berlin Conference as its rules. Those provisions were an imperial power could claim territory if and only if they effectively controlled or colonized that land. Slavery and the slave trade ended, and international conflict with European nations sought to be prevented. France and Britain almost went to war over Sudan in 1898, about to break a rule of the Berlin Conference, but France backed down. This was called the Fashoda Incident. Redrawn borders in Africa by the Europeans caused conflict because conflicting culture groups were now in the same territory, causing wars. Once Cecil Rhodes became Prime Minister in South Africa, he was the main sponsor of the Cape to Cairo Dream, a railroad crossing the entirety of Africa allowed conquerance of more territory. When Rhodes discovered gold and diamonds, he wanted to expand there, but the Boers controlled the region. This was the Boer War, and initially Boers defeated the British. The Kruger telegram was sent to Boers congratulating them on their success without German assistance, and this enraged the British at Germany. French controlled the west coast of Africa. Britain controlled the east, with Germany and Belgium in the middle. However, Italy would become the only European country to be defeated in Africa. There were two opium wars between Britain and China. Opium was a drug from poppy seeds, and the emperor didn't want addicts throughout his country. The first war was from 1839 to 1841, where Britain occupied China's coastal cities and forced them to open trade. So 4 treaty ports were open to British, and residents were immune from Chinese laws. In the Second War between 1856 and 1860, China was forced to open 6 more ports. East China was dominated by Britain, France, Russia, Japan, and Germany by the late 1800s. China was forced into an open-door trade policy by the U.S. The British East India Company controlled India after the 7 Years' War ended, and it became the jewel of the British Empire. India was one of first resources, especially the tea. The Sepoy Rebellion began in 1857 because Sepoys, Indians hired by the BEIC, resented the new British control and their use of animal fat for rifle cartridges because it was sacrilege to Muslims and Hindus. British Reformation in India included the implement of secondary education, economic development, and the Indian National Congress. In China, the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was an uprising by Chinese nationalists against Western domination, but was squashed by the imperialist forces. In 1853, Japan was forced to open ports but quickly modernized throughout the Meiji Restoration to become an imperial force. The Japanese and Russians had contrasting plans for Manchuria and Korea, causing the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. In the end, Westerners were mortified when Japan defeated a major Western power. The Treaty of Portsmouth ended the war, and its impacts were the Russian Revolution, annex of Korea, and revolt of Asia. Karl Marx and J. A. Hobson opposed imperialism. Marx, in Das Kapital, said the bourgeoisie needed to continuously expand markets for profit, causing conquest. Hobson thought imperialist forces only needed colonies to provide markets for European goods. Overall, imperialism was thought to only benefit the wealthy. Anti-imperialism surfaced from Hobson and comrades and continued to grow in Europe.